Queen Victoria deeply loved her husband, Prince Albert, but when he was just 42 years old, he tragically died, leaving her heartbroken. For years afterward, Victoria had an utterly morbid way of keeping his memory alive. Prince Albert was the consort of Queen Victoria and one of the most famous royal husbands in history. Still, people tend to see him as an obedient, romantic figure next to his powerful, desperately in love wife. But nothing could be further from the truth. Though he was of noble birth, Albert's childhood was a horror story. His father, Ernest I, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and mother, Princess Louise, were both reckless philanderers, and in 1826, after less than a decade of marriage, they split up. The next years of Albert's life were worthy of a Charles Dickens novel. For one, his mother, Princess Louise, got banished from court and never saw her sons again. Then Albert's father remarried his own niece, one of Albert's cousins. Carrying all this enormous baggage, Albert became determined to become twice the man his father was and threw himself into his studies at the University of Bonn. Not only was he an upstanding student, but he was also a frighteningly good sportsman, particularly when it came to fencing. Basically, Albert was turning himself into a Prince Charming, and his Cinderella was right around the corner. By the time Albert was a strapping 17-year-old, his ambitious uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, decided he had the perfect woman for Albert, the young Princess Victoria in England, who was poised to take the English throne in a matter of years. Albert and Victoria were first cousins, not exactly uncommon for the time, but pretty gross nonetheless. In fact, the royal circle was so small, the pair had shared the same midwife at their births, and when Albert was just 2 years old, his grandmother was already planning a wedding for the infants. With his uncle breathing down his neck, Albert travelled to meet the 16-year-old Victoria, and he quickly found a huge obstacle in his path. As it happened, the future Queen of England was very hot on the European marriage market, and a rogues gallery of eligible bachelors was already lining up to woo her. Only, Albert had a secret weapon. One of Albert's main rivals for Victoria's affections was Prince Alexander of Orange, another royal manly man who loved horse riding and adventuring. The one thing Alexander didn't have, though, was Albert's perfect face. Already a beautiful youth, Victoria described Albert as extremely handsome, praising his very sweet mouth with fine teeth and the delightful expression in his eyes. Meanwhile, she could only describe poor Alexander as very plain. In truth, Albert and Victoria were more like star-crossed lovers at the beginning. While the young royals were certainly attracted to each other, no proposal came during this visit, and Albert went home still a bachelor. Then, roughly a year after their initial courtship, Princess Victoria turned into Queen Victoria upon the death of her uncle King William IV, and everything changed. With Victoria finally on the throne, everyone expected a ring on her finger in good time. But Victoria's response was surprising and very unromantic. She refused to bow to pressure from her family. Instead, she vowed to stay single until she settled into her role as monarch. Still, despite her hesitancy, Victoria was head over heels. Soon enough, she proved her love in a very unconventional way. In October 1839, Queen Victoria and Albert made a strange kind of history. That day, Victoria was the one who proposed to him, not only breaking the traditions of the time, but also showing him that she was the one who was going to wear the pants in their relationship. In February 1840, the young couple married in the idyllic Chapel Royal at St James's Palace, with Victoria famously wearing a white wedding dress, turning the colour choice into an enormous fad. Mere weeks after the wedding, Albert got shocking news. Victoria was pregnant. Now, this should have been happy tidings, but it was far from it. As young as she was, Victoria had hoped to have at least a handful of months to enjoy her new bridegroom. Plus, the pair were barely in their 20s with no idea how to raise a family. Victoria wasn't just upset about her pregnancy, she was beside herself. Once more, her letters reveal the dark truth. She wrote to her grandmother complaining that the idea of a baby was spoiling her happiness. Victoria and Albert burned for each other in the bedroom, and their fighting style was equally fiery. Indeed, the couple had all-out brawls inside the palace. It got so bad, Victoria would often refuse to even speak to Albert, forcing him to resort to sliding contrite notes under her door to make up for whatever he said or did. During this twisted honeymoon period, Albert realised he had one deep dark fear about his marriage. Victoria's grandfather had been Mad King George III, and some of her rages around the palace closely mirrored her unhinged relatives. Albert couldn't help but wonder if she had inherited some of the royal madness. Still, for most couples, a coming baby means settling down and working through their differences, hereditary illnesses and all. Albert's new wife hated rearing children. Not only was she miserable about her pregnancies, not a whole lot after that pleased her. She thought newborn infants were ugly and had a deep aversion to breastfeeding. Yet at the centre of all this, there was something truly disturbing. Today, historians believe that Victoria suffered from postpartum depression, once calling pregnancy the heaviest trial she had ever had to endure. During these low periods, Albert's worst fears came true. At her most brutal nadirs, Victoria would even experience hallucinations, further linking her to Mad King George III. Albert's response to all of this was brutal. When it came to Victoria's fears about childbirth, Albert wasn't empathetic. He was annoyed at best and cruel at worst. In his letters to Victoria around her pregnancies, he complains about her moods and her lack of self-control, sneering at her crying over a miserable trifle. Incredibly though, it wasn't just mental dangers that Albert and Victoria had to face, they were also in grave physical danger. In the first few months of their marriage, Albert and a very pregnant Victoria were riding in a carriage to visit her mother. Suddenly, a vicious twist of fate confronted them. Out of nowhere, a mentally ill teenager named Edward Oxford shot at the royal couple. Although they were both unharmed, Albert was shaken down to his foundations, and his life wasn't going to get any easier. In the end, Victoria was in for a huge disappointment with her eldest child. It was a girl, a princess she called Vicky, and almost no one treated it as a cause for celebration. When the attending doctor apparently said mournfully, "Oh madam, it's a girl," Victoria shot back, "Never mind, next time it will be a prince." But Victoria and Albert would learn to be careful what they wished for. True to her word, the second child Victoria had with Albert was indeed a boy, Prince Albert, nicknamed Bertie. Yet, this was just the beginning of a lifelong and tragic struggle. Although Victoria and Albert went on to have a whopping 7 more children, it was their eldest son, Bertie, who received all the pressure. Albert, in particular, was determined to mould Bertie into the perfect man, until it all backfired spectacularly. Unlike many Victorian fathers, Albert took a keen interest in bringing up his children, even attending all their births and developing a rigorous educational curriculum for them. Perhaps trying to atone for his own father's rakish sins, Albert overcorrected and became a hugely overbearing father. Despite his best efforts, his eldest son and heir, Bertie, proved to be the most difficult of his children to tame. The boy preferred roughhousing to Albert's schoolroom teachings, and Albert grew more disappointed by the year. Eventually, the consort took to personally caning the Prince of Wales if he failed his classes or misbehaved, as if intense corporal punishment would fix things. As the royal couple raised their children and Victoria got more confident as queen, an unfixable rift developed between them, namely jealousy. Albert chafed at the idea of Victoria dominating him as monarch, while Victoria was staunchly determined to keep every ounce of regal power for herself, often refusing to let Albert take over her duties even when she was pregnant. Within a couple of years, Albert was going stir-crazy, and if Victoria thought it would get better with time, she was mistaken. One of the main sore spots for Albert was the fact that Victoria's old childhood governess, Baroness Lazen, was now running his household, and Albert just so happened to despise her. Unable to deal with the Baroness's matronly hold over his grown wife, Albert dubbed her the House Dragon and refused to have any dealings with her. Albert finally made a stand in these power games with a vengeful show of his strength. He outright attempted a coup, accusing the Baroness of mismanaging his home and putting his children in danger. Furious, he demanded that Queen Victoria boot the woman out, and waited with bated breath for the answer. Victoria realised her insecure husband needed her to be a submissive wife at that moment, and not a dominant queen, and she eventually agreed to send Lazen off packing. Starting in 1859, when Albert was still a healthy and relatively young man, the consort experienced debilitating stomach cramps. No matter what he did or what royal doctor he saw, no one could quite figure out what the matter was, and his condition only got worse the more he took cures and treatments. It was enough to make anyone frustrated, but it hit Albert in a particularly cruel fashion. Within a few months of falling ill, an eerie and ominous change came over him. Even Albert's own biographer admitted that it was around this time that he lost the will to live. Suddenly, Albert's once active, mentally acute lifestyle turned inward on itself and led to listlessness and depression. Around this time, an ugly truth became clear to Albert. His son Bertie wasn't just uninterested in his studies, he was going to make a horrible king. After all, Bertie wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. As he grew up, he became very interested in women. Much to his father's horror, he started taking up with the brash Irish actress Nellie Clifton, a woman who was certainly not going to help the still teenage prince with his homework. But whatever Albert initially thought was going on between Nellie and his son, the truth was 10 times worse. While Bertie was away from his strict father during a trip to Ireland with the army, he had yet another rendezvous with Nellie. According to reports, he and Nellie wasted no time on their solo adventures, as Bertie's fellow cadets allowed her to hide out in their barracks for 3 days while she and Bertie had their fun. So the story goes, Albert's precious son lost his virginity to Clifton during those 3 days, and when Albert found out, he was furious. Albert had not only sacrificed much of his manhood to be a good husband to Queen Victoria, his own philandering father had shown him the havoc that could come from womanizing. Accordingly, he was so angry and disturbed over his son's lack of morality, he wrote Bertie a scathing letter, calling him out for being a fallen man. After Albert sent the letter, he still worried not only for his son's soul, but for his family's reputation. He and Victoria feared that Bertie's activities would get out in the press, or, worst of all, that Nellie Clifton would get pregnant. To keep the rumour mill at bay, Albert decided to take matters into his own hands. He personally travelled to see Bertie in late November 1860 to give his boy a tongue lashing for acting out and flouting his royal duties. It couldn't have gone more horribly. Not only did Albert's stern words fall on deaf ears, they had decided to hash out their differences during a long, cold walk in the November rain. This was not good for Albert's failing health. Once he finished chastising Bertie, Albert returned back home and began to experience horrific symptoms. In addition to his chronic stomach cramps, he now had shooting pains running up and down his back and legs. By early December, Albert's state had weakened even more significantly, and the palace called in one of their best doctors to take a look at him. After looking the royal consort up and down, the doctor's diagnosis was grim. According to him, Prince Albert was suffering from typhoid fever. The end came swift and brutal. On December 14th, 1860, fewer than 3 weeks after he travelled to confront his son, Albert died just before midnight in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, one of Queen Victoria's favourite residencies. Like Albert, Queen Victoria had never been particularly fond of young Bertie. After all, she too thought he was a screw-up. When Prince Albert passed, her dislike transformed into a profound sense of hatred. She blamed him and his affair with Nellie almost entirely for Albert's death. She wrote to her eldest daughter that "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder," and denied him any political power or position until the day she died. Still, even with all of this grief, Victoria went from heartbroken to very disturbed. To say Queen Victoria took Albert's death badly is an understatement. Aside from blaming and all but disowning her son Bertie, she sunk into a deep depression and most infamously wore black for the rest of her life. This last habit earned her the mournful nickname, the Widow of Windsor. Except that's just the most well-known of Victoria's mourning customs. Overcome with grief, Victoria retreated from public life, and her private habits were nothing short of bizarre. In the long years after Albert's passing, Victoria insisted that her servants keep his rooms continually prepared, as if he was just going to walk through the doors one day. Aides always placed a bowl of hot water for shaving on a side table and laid out a new change of clothes on his bed. Victoria's lifelong mourning of Albert is notorious, but most people don't know that it extended to her own funeral. In contrast to her permanent black, Victoria requested that she wear a white dress and her wedding veil once her attendants buried her. She had waited decades to reunite with her beloved Albert, and she wanted to meet him as a renewed bride. At the time of his passing, the doctors still believed that Albert's cause of death was typhoid fever, but modern historians have a much more disturbing suggestion. Given Albert's chronic stomach issues, they believe he could have been suffering from a long-term fatal illness like kidney failure or Crohn's disease, making his death not just random bad luck, but an excruciating drawn-out process. One of Albert's greatest achievements was the Great Exhibition of 1851, and the impact of his hard work led to what is now called Albertopolis. This is the London area of South Kensington, which famously contains many institutions that come from the surplus of the Great Exhibition, including the Royal College of Art and Royal Albert Hall. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.